With me now is Brad Maxwell. He's the Managing Executive Investment Banking at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. Thank you so much for your time, Brad. Well, we're here at the World Economic Forum, and I just want to get a sense on how you feel the COVID environment has derailed this transition to green in emerging markets.
Good morning, Bronwyn, and thanks so much for the conversation that we're going to have today. And from my perspective, I think certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the global economy over the last 2.5 years. And I think the way I like to look at it is that it has potentially really looked at not derailing the overall climate change objectives, but really just slowing it down to an extent, because a lot of governments have had to focus on the last 2.5 years really on the key crisis around health, the safety of their people, saving lives, and also saving jobs, and really getting their own individual economies going again from a perspective of not losing jobs, creating income, certainly ensuring that the value chains and supply chains continue. So from my perspective, I certainly don't think it has derailed anything. But the other key point I would like to raise is that also I think what we're going to see between now and 2050 is that during all these years, there are going to be certain global events that are going to continue, of which COVID-19 was one of them. But if you take the current Ukraine-Russian war that we're going through at the moment, we're going to continue to see events like these and others, which will really make governments and countries think through their security of their energy supply, which third parties they're reliant on. And I think a lot of these key aspects will ultimately impact some of the decision making. But fundamentally for me, we cannot move off what is critical in terms of the climate change journey that we're on.
What is Nedbank CIB doing specifically to contribute to net zero targets and also to lower emissions across industry, Brad?
So, Bronwyn, from our perspective, we're looking at a couple of things. I think certainly we're looking at within the broader Nedbank group, moving back to ultimately our purpose, which is really to use our financial expertise to do good to individuals, families, businesses, and societies. And through that purpose, we've signed up to various sustainable development goals where we believe we can have the biggest impact. And one of those is actually clean energy, which is the topic of some of the discussion that we're having today. And I think for me, if we actually take that beyond that, Nedbank was one of the first banks who actually announced our energy policy. And that really sets out the blueprint and some of our glide path to a carbon neutral economy in terms of how we actually deliver that between now and 2050. And that certainly incorporates aspects like over time, we're going to no longer be financing oil production and new oil production, not project financing, new thermal coal production, and ultimately how we set that out and transition to that carbon neutral economy. I think embedded in that is also the policy and the climate frameworks within the bank, and there's been a tremendous amount of work done on that. So if we just take the renewable energy program as an example, we've actually committed to fund up to 50 billion rand in the renewable energy program. To date, we've actually financed around about 30 billion rand in terms of that renewable energy program. So I think it's really how we work with our clients in that just transition over this period.
And then the other question, of course, is to what extent local communities are going to benefit from this transition to green, to clean energy in emerging markets? How can we ensure that the benefits are equitable?
Yes, Bronwyn, I think for me, I think the key impact is if we look at climate change, it's going to impact all of us, but it certainly impacts the most vulnerable communities the most. And if we just look at this weekend's events in KZN and the floods we had again this weekend, it certainly shows evidence on that. So I think the fundamental thing for me is how do we create the policy frameworks and environments that ensure that everyone is able to participate in this just transition. I think it's always in a lot of discussions that we have around ESG, it's really focusing on the E and the S, and how you actually balance the two of those, I think, is critically important. So ultimately, for me, from a South African government perspective, and if I look at South Africa's NDC, which is the nationally determined contribution, it really sets out very clearly how do we get a balance between socioeconomic benefits and also the climate resilience. And I think those 2 points are fundamentally important as to how we actually balance that. So ultimately for me, in terms of South African investment into future mitigation and future adaptation strategies, which will benefit all parties and also local communities, I think it's critically important as to how we get that balance between both of those elements. And I think if done properly, we can deliver on both of those objectives.
Now, here at the World Economic Forum, of course, it's a meeting of minds from all over the world. Do you really think we're going to see enough efforts from the developed world to help facilitate this transition in emerging markets?
So, Bronwyn, if we go back to the original objectives of the Paris Agreement, and it really sets out a lot of objectives, but if I look at it, it really spoke to three things around how does the developed world provide finance to developing countries? How do they look at technology and technology transfer? And also, how do they assist with providing capacity and what they refer to as capacity building? And I think if we just reflect on those three elements, I think those are the key elements of discussion at the World Economic Forum. And I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the outcomes and the discussions over this coming week. But for me, from my perspective, I do see a lot of progress, certainly from a finance perspective. If we look at COP26, certainly the UK, Germany, France, the US, and other areas of the EU committed to 134 billion rand to South Africa to really assist us in our financing of this just transition. And I think that really is evidence of a step in the right direction. And I think for me, in addition to that, what is important is also really understanding some of the global technology benefits and some of that technology learnings and transfer that we could all kind of discuss and consider. And then also it comes down to capacity. I think one of the key things for me is really around the implementation and execution of the plan and having sufficient capacity to actually deliver into that. So I think from those three elements, certainly for me, there is a big role that the developed economies need to assist the developing economies in their own just transition journeys. And I certainly look forward to hearing some of the outcomes of this week's events and COP27 that's coming up.
Another discussion point will be, of course, blended finance models, innovative finance models that are necessary to help the climate transition in high-emitting economies. You're a banker. This must be magic to your ears. Innovative, blended financing solutions, Brad.
Very much so, Bronwyn. And I think if I look at the work we're doing with our clients to date, and a lot of clients are at different stages in each of their own journeys, and we do a lot of work from initial advisory work to some of our clients in terms of some of their strategic thinking around climate change. And in addition to that is really, to your point, how do you come up with innovative financing solutions and structures that can assist in this? To date, I think from a South African perspective and a global perspective, there's been a lot of focus really on use of proceeds, fundraising opportunities in terms of bonds and loans, and likewise sustainability-linked loans. And each of them have got different aspects to it. Use of proceeds really goes directly in terms of the funding that you've raised to specific green, social, or sustainable projects. And sustainable linked loans is really used for more general corporate purposes, but there are very key performance indicators and measures that are set up in place that companies are expected to deliver into that is related to that funding. From a global perspective, I think the global financial institutions are certainly collaborating around these innovative funding instruments, because this is a global challenge. It's something that we collectively need to deliver into. And for me, that thinking is continuously progressing. And certainly we've got a lot of transactions that we've closed in both the use of proceeds and sustainability linked loans in working with our clients in the journeys that they're on at the moment.
And then finally, obviously, the forum, the World Economic Forum, is about looking at challenges, providing solutions. But if you were to underpin the biggest challenge for emerging markets when it comes to this energy transition, is it easy to decide what that is?
So I think for me, it's really down to a couple of things. I think a lot of this always comes back to the underlying regulatory environments and also the policy environment that is put in place. And I think there's a lot of good work that we're doing in South Africa at the moment, and certainly other developing economies are doing the same, really around our SA Green Finance Taxonomy. There's the Presidential Climate Commission, and likewise there's the Climate Change Bill that is all currently under discussion and out for discussion amongst the various parties. So I think firstly, I think that framework is critically important from what we operate within. so that each company operating within each sector and each industry understands what they're aiming to deliver into. And I think traction on that is critically important. I think then in addition to that, it comes back to the elements that we were talking about earlier around funding and ensuring that from certainly a South African perspective, financial institutions, the likes of ourselves and others, plus the global DFIs and other finance and capital providers are working together to ensure that that the funding is available to deliver into this investment that is required for the mitigation and adaptation strategies. And then ultimately for me, everything comes down to implementation and execution. Now, if we look at our renewable energy program that we've had in South Africa over many years, it really is an example of excellent collaboration between the public and private sector, how we've been able to have a regulatory environment and policy framework that allowed us to attract foreign investment, deliver into those projects, and also at the same time create significant opportunities and job creation in certain of the communities around the areas of these projects. So I think for me, it really comes down to those things: having the right regulatory frameworks and policies, having the funding in place. I think a commitment from all parties in terms of the speed of implementation and execution to deliver into this plan. And we certainly as Nedbank are very excited about the journey from today out all the way through to 2050, the targets that we have set ourselves, and to deliver a carbon neutral economy.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to the discussion, climate transition in emerging markets. It's our big debate that we're going to be bringing live from the World Economic Forum here in Davos. Brad, thank you so much for your time. Brad Maxwell is the Managing Executive Investment Banking at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank.